Fellas, I'm going to try and create the greatest UFC roster of all time. So I'm going to go through every weight class in the UFC and kind of rebuild the top 10 with fighters from different eras in the UFC, fighters from the golden era of the UFC, current fighters, old fighters, great fighters, to try and rebuild the best UFC roster you can possibly make in every single weight class. So we have ultimately a bunch of fighters who have achieved a shit ton of stuff, or just an insanely talented top 10 in the UFC that will probably be the best top 10 you can possibly make, including new and old fighters. And we'll start with the heavyweight division. The first fighter that I'm going to include when rebuilding the heavyweight division is going to be Tom Aspinall. Yeah, Tom Aspinall's one of a kind in the heavyweight division, and I think already he's proved that he's one of the best, not the greatest, but one of the best heavyweights of all time. He's the quickest and most athletic heavyweight of all time. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a single heavyweight in the history of MMA who is faster or more athletic, maybe more athletic, but definitely not faster than Tom Aspinall. He's got the speed like a welterweight. He is currently the best heavyweight in the world as well in the modern era of the heavyweight division, which is quite impressive as well, because, I mean, the modern era is definitely more favourable, and he's definitely better than Jones and Stipe. I mean, most people would consider him the real champion, even though technically he is the interim champion. Most people consider him the best in the UFC, and he's just got everything going from him. He's well-rounded, he's got the grappling, he's got the striking, he's dangerous, shortest average fight time in the UFC. Like, imagine we saw Aspinall versus Prime Fedor Emelianenko, or Aspinall versus Ngannou. This is what I'm saying about the prestige heavyweight. So the first fighter that I'm going to include in the best heavyweight roster of all time would be the current champion, Tom Aspinall. I'm also going to include John Jones. Now, the only reason I'm going to include John Jones is because I know he's kind of holding up the division right now, but if we're trying to build the best current UFC heavyweight roster full of a bunch of killers, there ain't no easy fights for John Jones. He is unbeaten, he is the greatest of all time in the light heavyweight division, and I'd like to see how Jones would perform in the heavyweight division if he was against these these top heavyweights. He is currently the heavyweight UFC champ. Fair enough, he's ducking Aspinall, he's not taking on the toughest test, but he is the current champion. And to be fair to him, he did demolish a new generation heavyweight. And I'm going to be favouring a lot of these newer heavyweights compared to the old ones, because, you know, time moves on and people get better. So him demolishing a new generation heavyweight in Cyril Gane, it is impressive. So I'm going to include John Jones just because I think he'd mix up the heavyweight division really well. Well, I'd love to see Jones versus an Ngannou, or Jones versus Aspinall, even just a Jones versus a Prime Stipe, current Jones versus a Prime Stipe would be fun. So I'm going to include John Jones. The next fighter is 2005 Fedor Emelianenko. Basically any Fedor from 2000 to 2009 you can include. I think he was around his prime in 2005. He's the second greatest heavyweight of all time. Some people say he's the greatest heavyweight of all time. 18 lineal title defenses, not in the UFC obviously, but 18 straight lineal title defenses in different promotions. This dude was just an absolute killer, unbeaten from 2000 to 2002. I'm pretty sure it was 2000, maybe I got that wrong, but 2002 to 2009 pretty much he was unbeaten, and he demolished literally every heavyweight in his era. Prime Fedor, there are people that still think Prime Fedor beats the current heavyweights in the world. I mean, if you're talking about the likes of Marcin Tybura, yeah, he runs through them, but even the likes of Aspinall, like imagine Prime Fedor versus Aspinall, or Prime Fedor versus Ngannou, or any of the top heavyweights, like Prime Fedor versus Prime Stipe. And in his era of the heavyweight division, when he was in his prime, he was demolishing everyone, and he's deemed as the most difficult heavyweight to beat of all time. So imagine Fedor Emelianenko in his prime, fighting at the same time as Prime Aspinall. That would be like peak heavyweight action right there. So I'm going to include Fedor Emelianenko, second arguably the greatest heavyweight of all time. And I'm going to include my personal pick of the greatest heavyweight of all time, 2016 Stipe Miocic. You can do anywhere from 2016 to about 2019 in my opinion, just a couple of years before the Ngannou loss. But yeah, Prime Stipe, again, in my opinion, the greatest heavyweight of all time. You've got to include him in there. And he's got the most heavyweight title defenses in the UFC. The UFC is mainly known as the prestigious company. Getting the most defenses in the heavyweight division is impressive, and he's beaten so many legends and former champions. Fair enough, if we look at the current UFC roster, he might have not got that many wins, but again, we're talking about 2016, we're talking about Prime Stipe, and he ran the heavyweight division for a few years. Like, I'd love to see Prime Stipe versus current Jones, even though I still think current Stipe could be difficult for current Jones. Imagine Prime Stipe Miocic fighting the likes of Aspinall, or Prime Stipe versus, like I said before, Prime Fedor. So I'm going to include Prime Stipe. If we're talking about the heavyweight division, you can't not include him. The next fighter, 2013 Cain Velasquez. Cain Velasquez is one of the most grueling heavyweights that have ever walked the UFC. Absolute mauler. Reminds me a bit of Anthony Hernandez in the middleweight division, the way that he just absolutely dominated people. And in my opinion, one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. I included him in my top 30 GOAT list because I do think he's one of the greatest of all time. He's got everything you want in a heavyweight. He's a crazy brawler. He's got knockout power. He's a wrestling beast. He's like everything you could possibly want in a heavyweight. He's beat some monsters in his career as well. Having Prime Cain Velasquez back in about that 2013 era to add to this heavyweight roster, I think would also be a good addition to the roster. So yeah, one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. One of the funnest heavyweights to watch as well. Prime Cain Velasquez. Next fighter, 2020 Francis Ngannou. just like I said, I know I keep doing these matchups, but imagine Prime and Ngannou. I mean, you can argue that he's still in his prime now, but I think that the Ngannou that showed up against Stipe Miocic is one of the most dangerous heavyweights of all time. And I do think that Ngannou in general is the most dangerous heavyweight of all time. Heavyweight, when you think of the heavyweight division, you think of these power punchers, guys that are going to go out there, have a brawl, and knock each other out. Ngannou personifies that person, like, perfectly. To think that heavyweight is by far the hardest hitting division in the UFC, and Ngannou is the hardest hitter in the heavyweight division, I'd love to see Ngannou, prime Ngannou, about 2020 Ngannou in this mix. He is a legend killer. Every legend that he goes against, he ends up killing. He knocked out Stipe Miocic, he knocked out Arlovski, he knocked out Cain Velasquez, he's knocked out a bunch of legends in his time, and he could KO any heavyweight on any given day. I don't care if you're matching him up against prime Fedor, even current Aspinall, prime Stipe, whoever you're matching up against. Ngannou has the capability to knock out any heavyweight on any given day. The power's different. He's still one of the best heavyweights in the world, top 3 best heavyweights right now, even though he's not in the UFC. You've got to include Ngannou. Next fighter, 2019 DC. I'm so mad that DC not that he retired too early, because I think it was the smart choice to retire, but imagine we ended up seeing like DC versus Ngannou, or DC versus Aspinall, just DC versus some of the better heavyweights nowadays. And I think he was in his prime around 2019, a couple of years before that as well, in the heavyweight division at least. And he's only lost to Stipe in the heavyweight division, and he still has a win over him. In the heavyweight division alone, the only guy he's lost to is the greatest heavyweight of all time, in my opinion, in Stipe, and he still has a knockout win over him. He's one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. And what impressed me about DC, he was undersized, and he still battered everyone. He was tiny for the heavyweight division, he was still going out there and absolutely battering everyone. I'd love to see DC in the mix of the heavyweight division in this roster. One of the few, not the few, but considering a lot of the heavyweights on this list are strikers or do have predominantly a striking base, having 2019 DC with the wrestling that he brings, I think it'd be a great addition. Back when he was knocking out Stipe and putting up tough fights against him in his prime, having DC, you've got to include him. I'm going to have 2010 Brock Lesnar. Again, I said with Ngannou, I think Brock Lesnar is one of the best fighters to personify the heavyweight division. He's just a freak of nature. Like, you look up to Brock Lesnar, he's like the perfect image for the heavyweight division. He's a heavyweight champion with multiple defenses. Fair enough, he might have had an easy road, but he still has multiple defenses. Roided up Brock Lesnar in his prime back in 2010. You've got to include him in the golden age. He was one of the biggest stars in heavyweight history, and the dude's absolutely huge. I mean, heavyweights are all huge, but this dude was on another level. And I wish we still had the likes of Brock Lesnar. Like, why have we got to go out there and watch Romanov and these fat heavyweights that just don't really put on good performances? I'm not even mad if you bring somebody like Brock Lesnar, roid them to the max, and include them in the heavyweight division. Let Brock Lesnar roid up, put him in this heavyweight roster. Let's see him against Ngannou. Let's see him against someone that's a guaranteed finish. I want to include Lesnar. 2002 Kevin Randleman, the OG of the heavyweight division. This guy was Ngannou before Ngannou existed. He is the OG heavyweight Ngannou, the powerhouse, the freak of nature. He was huge. He was roided up, similar to Brock Lesnar. And fair enough, from a talent perspective, you can't really compare him to most of the heavyweights from like 2015 onwards. But this dude roided up. He's a physical specimen. He's like Yoel Romero if he fought in the heavyweight division. Nearly finished Fedor Emelianenko as well, who's considered one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. For Kevin Randleman to do that to prime, or maybe not prime, but to do that to Fedor Emelianenko as well, you've got to include Kevin Randleman, OG in the heavyweight division. He's basically Ngannou before the UFC had Ngannou, so I'm going to include him and spice things up in the heavyweight division. And I'm also going to include Sergey Pavlovich. Fair enough, he's not got this long legacy. He hasn't even touched a belt, but it's not about accomplishments. This isn't a GOAT list in the heavyweight division. This is if I had to build a top 10 of the heavyweight division, who would I include? I'm including Pavlovich, finishing machine before Aspinall, for 6 first-round knockouts in a row. Still one of the most dangerous heavyweights in the world. And he's got good skills. Greco-Roman wrestler. Long, rangy, powerful boxing. Again, I'm going to go back with the matchmaking, but imagine Sergey Pavlovich versus Fedor Emelianenko. Sergey Pavlovich versus Ngannou. Okay, probably get slept, but just imagine Prime Randleman or Prime Lesnar versus Sergey Pavlovich. He's one of the most goated brawlers in the UFC. No one can beat him in just a pure brawling battle. I'm going to include Sergey Pavlovich. We've never really seen, not that we've never really seen, but he's unique in the heavyweight division, is Pavlovich, and even though he's now on a 2-fight losing streak and he's not one of the best, add him to the mix. So I'm going to include Pavlovich, and this would be my heavyweight division. A bunch of guys who have a great legacy, a bunch of the old guys like Randleman and Fedor, a bunch of the current guys like Pavlovich and Aspinall, guys in between. This would be my peak heavyweight division. If all these guys were fighting in the same division at the same time, it would be the greatest UFC heavyweight roster. And then for the light heavyweight division, the first fighter I'm going to include is Alex Pereira, one of the greatest light heavyweights of all time, despite only fighting in the light heavyweight division since, 2020? When did he debut? It was against Jan Blachowicz back in 2023. 2023, weren't it? So he's been in less than a year. He's beat a bunch of former champions on his resume. I mean, Jamal Hill, Jan Blachowicz, Jiří Procházka, these are the guys that he's beaten in the light heavyweight division, and he beat Jiří twice. And he's already one of the greatest light heavyweights of all time in just 1.5 years. He's kind of just speedrunning the UFC. In my opinion, the most dangerous striker in light heavyweight history. Even some of the roided guys that used to be fighting back in the day, I still think Poton's got to be one of the most dangerous. Finished Jamal Hill, finished Jiří Procházka twice. Finished Khalil Roundtree in the light heavyweight division. The only guy that's been able to survive so far has been Jan Blachowicz, and even he was wobbling all over the place in that third round. And he's a striking machine. I'm going to include Poton, one of the greatest of all time in my opinion in the UFC, regardless of the division, and already one of the greatest light heavyweights of all time, and he's fun, and he's dangerous. You've got to include him. Next fighter, 2016 John Jones. Maybe this is a bit past his prime, but around this time, if we've got to include Prime Jones. Some people think a fantasy matchup would be Prime Jones versus current Alex Pereira, and even though I think Jones would submit him, I still think that's an amazing fight. He's the greatest of all time, both in and outside the light heavyweight division. If you're talking light heavyweight, it's got to be Jones. He did literally own the light heavyweight division for like a decade straight. And it impressed me how he beat like 3 different generations of light heavyweight. He beat the old generation, before him. He beat his generation, and then he beat the future generation of the light heavyweight division. 3 different generations just showed how long he ran the light heavyweight division for, beating literally everyone, beat people at their own game. So we've got to include John Jones. He is the king of the light heavyweight division. He is the greatest of all time in the light heavyweight division. Fair enough, might have taken some PEDs, but I mean, so was half the roster back when he was active. So I'm including John Jones, greatest light heavyweight of all time. 2015, Alexander Gustafsson. Fair enough, Gustafsson might have lost to John Jones. He might have lost to DC. But in his prime, he put up a really close fight against both of those guys. And I would say he's the greatest light heavyweight to never win a belt. Some people would consider him one of the greatest in the UFC history to never win a belt. Arguably beat John Jones the first time around. Nearly beat DC. Nearly finished DC as well. He's a phenomenal kickboxer. Very, very tough to beat on the feet. And I think he would match up really well against even some modern light heavyweights like Prime Gustafsson versus current Jan Blachowicz, or Prime Gustafsson versus Jiří Procházka. These are some fights that I really want to see. I don't think he's officially retired, but he's definitely inactive. I don't think he's fought since his Krylov knockout, but the point is he's washed. Prime Gustafsson, I think you've got to have him in the light heavyweight of all time debate, especially when it comes to building a perfect roster. Next fighter, 2007 Rampage Jackson. I mean, talk about characters. He's like Kevin Holland before we had Kevin Holland, but even more unfiltered. Yeah, he's the OG BMF. This dude was the OG BMF, fighting anyone at any time. Stopped Prime Liddell for the belt. When Liddell was on his run, looking unstoppable, this guy stopped him for the belt. Fought so many legends back in the day. Powerful as fuck. Okay, fair enough, maybe from a skills perspective, he might not be able to compare to some of today's light heavyweights. He was a bit ploddy, walked forward, didn't have the best grappling, but I feel like you've just got to spice things up in the light heavyweight division. Take away the Rakic's and all the boring fighters who don't really offer anything to the UFC. Fuck Anthony Smith. Bring in Rampage Jackson. I'm including him in the roster for the light heavyweight division. Next fighter, 2016 Anthony Johnson. RIP. Hardest hitter in light heavyweight history. One of the most powerful punches in the UFC. DC even said this dude landed a jab on DC and sent him flying across half the octagon. In my opinion, the hardest hitter of the light heavyweight division in light heavyweight history. It'd have been fun to see him versus Jones. You can compare him to Ngannou when it comes to power. One of the most dangerous light heavyweights of all time, like I just said. He's going to be scored a shit ton of knockouts. Strong as an ox as well. So strong for the weight class. And similar to what I said about Ngannou, he can knock anyone out at any given time. You put him against any light heavyweight at any given moment, and obviously he has lost to a lot of light heavyweights, but he's got the capability and the power to finish anyone at any given time. And because of that, and because he perfectly personifies one of these bigger guys, I'm including Rumble Johnson, man. So I'm taking Rumble Johnson as well. Jiří Procházka. We've never seen anyone like Jiří Procházka in the UFC. There's nobody like him. In the light heavyweight division's history, there's been nobody like Jiří Procházka. One of the weirdest, most unorthodox fighters of all time. And coming into the UFC, we were a bit worried that he was going to get fraud checked, but he's become a champion. He was a former champion. So his weird style works. Never in a boring fight. He's not had a single boring fight in the UFC so far. Had one of the best fights in history against Glover Teixeira. And he is the definition of kill or be killed. Jiří Procházka is like a fighter you'd expect to see in Pride like 20 years back. Not in 2024. But the fact that we have him nowadays and the fact that he is a former champion in the modern era, of course I'm going to include Jiří. 2018 DC. Yeah, 2018 DC. Again, similar to what I said in the light heavyweight division, he's one of the light heavyweight heavyweights, like best wrestlers ever. Such a good wrestler, definitely the best wrestler on this list so far. And you put Prime DC in the light heavyweight division against current Porton. Porton aren't winning that fight. Only lost to Jones in the light heavyweight division, who is considered the greatest of all time. Obviously lost a decision, and then one of them was when he was on PEDs. Absolutely demolished most of the light heavyweights he went against. Even some of the modern light heavyweights got dominated by DC. Like, you look at Volkan Oezdemir, for example, got bullied by DC when they fought. He was mauling, and he's now a top 10 light heavyweight as well. And nobody could really beat DC in the light heavyweight division apart from Jones. You've got to include DC in the mix. 2006 Chuck Liddell. Again, this is more of a pioneer pick rather than, like, you know, a skilled pick, but he's the OG of the light heavyweight division. UFC's first big star. He was like the first kind of paper boy of the UFC back in 2006, and he ran the light heavyweight division in early 2000s. Again, you put Prime Liddell against current Porton, he's getting slept. But at least from a pioneer point of view, and the fact that he is one of the greatest of all time, you've got to include him. And he has beaten some of the all-time greats as well back on his run, beating, you know, some of the best at the time. So I'm going to include Prime Liddell. Back in the day, more of a pioneer thing, more of a respect thing, but I'm still going to include him when it comes to light heavyweights. Next fighter, 2019 Dominic Reyes. I still think Reyes, even to this day, has really good skills. I think he but I still think he beat Smith. Obviously, the chin is what let him down, but the Dominic Reyes that fought John Jones, yeah, that dude, you've got to include him in this list. Arguably beat John Jones. I mean, is it even arguable? Most people think full stop he just beat John Jones, and he was the guy to beat him. He was so dangerous on his come up as well, finishing everyone. Few light heavyweights in the history of this division, in my opinion, beat Prime Reyes. I know he got finished by Ryan Spann, but I'm talking about Prime Reyes before he got demolished, but before he lost to Jones, and then after that, lost his chin and got demolished by everyone after that. But even though, you know, cannot make an argument that he beat Jones. And he's just such a dynamic striker as well. So fun to watch on the feet. I'm including Prime Reyes on this list just because I'm really intrigued to see how him in his prime, when he fought John Jones, would have done against some of the other light heavyweights. Because up until that moment, it was just finishing everyone. 2004 Randy Couture, similar to the Chuck Liddell point, more of a pioneer thing. But, you know, Randy Couture is one of the greatest as well. He is one of the greatest of all time, in my opinion. Top 20 greatest of all time. He became the light heavyweight champion on so many different occasions. You could never count him out in his prime. The second you think he's done and he's washed, he comes back and wins the belt a fight later. Very well-rounded, had the striking, had the grappling. I'm including Randy Couture in this list as well of light heavyweight goats. So this is what the light heavyweight division would look like if I had to completely rebuild it, including some of the goats, some of the current fighters like Porton and Yuri, some of the OG fighters like Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell, guys in between. I think if these guys were all competing at the same time in the light heavyweight division, it would be bliss. It would be the greatest division in the UFC by far. So that's my light heavyweight division. Then the middleweight division. We've had some tough errors in the middleweight division. When Adesanya was champion, the middleweight division was in a tough spot. Dricus du Plessis, I don't care how weird or how, you know, bad he looks until he gets a win. Dricus du Plessis has one of the best back-to-back-to-back wins in middleweight history, finishing Adesanya, finishing Whittaker, and beating Strickland back-to-back-to-back, and being a modern champion in the UFC on top of that, and the fact that he's undefeated in the UFC. He's super underrated, in my opinion, very well-rounded. He's got power on the feet, finished Whittaker on the feet. And he's also obviously got grappling as well. Unbeaten in the UFC so far. Nobody's been able to beat this the guy in the UFC. And he's got a goated heart. Very few people can even match when it comes to Dricus du Plessis when it comes to heart. Fair enough, he might look terrible. He might look like he's gassing out. He might look done. And then he'll just pull off a finish right out of nowhere. I'm including Dricus du Plessis. Some people have even made the argument that current Dricus du Plessis beats Prime Silver. And even though I think you can't really 100% for certainty say that anyone beats Prime Silver, I mean, Dricus du Plessis, more of a modern fighter, looks unstoppable, so I'm including Dricus du Plessis. Obviously, I'm going to include Anderson Silva as well. 2012 Anderson Silva, previous to when he got KO'd by Weidman and then snapped his leg. He's the greatest middleweight of all time. I mean, not only is he a pioneer for this division, but he is the greatest of all time, and he's one of the greatest strikers of all time as well. He was levels above everyone at the time. Like, back when Anderson Silva was in his prime, it was almost as if he was competing in the wrong era, and he was supposed to be competing in the future because he was just so far ahead of anyone. It was like he was putting 5% effort in and demolishing everyone. He would still be competitive, in my opinion, against most top middleweights these days. You get Prime Silva, put him in the top 10 of the current middleweight division, I think he beats, you know, a couple of the guys in that division there. So skilled, super technical, one of the greatest of all time. So I'm going to include Anderson Silva. I'd love to see like Prime Silva versus Prime Izzy, or Prime Silva versus the current, some of the, like I just said, some of the current top middleweights. So I'm including Prime Silva. Next fighter, 2020 Israel Adesanya. Adesanya gets a lot of hate in the middleweight division. He has kind of fallen off. He's not really been able to pick up a win. He's not been consistent. He ain't a champion anymore. But I'm going to include Prime Adesanya. 2020. I mean, in my opinion, he's the second greatest middleweight of all time, just behind Anderson Silva. Top 20 greatest of all time in striking. Back when he was running the middleweight division, fair enough, he weren't facing elite competition. He was facing the likes of Marvin Vettori for the belt. But I still think he's top 20 greatest of all time, just from a striking perspective. Like I said, I'd love to see him versus Prime Silva. Ran the middleweight division in his prime. Might have not been the golden age of the middleweight division, but nobody could beat him. Who ended up lapping him. I mean, the Whittaker wins as well as too, so that was also some good wins for Adesanya. Always been a top middleweight. Like, even now that he's fallen off, he's still top 3 middleweight in the world, and he has one of the best modern resumes. If you look at modern fighters in the middleweight division, Adesanya's probably got the best resume out of all those guys. So when it comes to modern fighters, I've got to include 2020 Adesanya. The one that finished Paulo Costa, in my opinion, was when he was in his prime or around that time. So I'm going to include Israel Adesanya in the roster. Next fighter, 2013 Vitor Belfort. Yeah, this dude was just so dangerous in his prime. Like, juiced up Vitor Belfort, absolute animal. The second he landed that head kick, everyone's going to sleep. One of the most dangerous middleweights we've ever seen in UFC history. Beat up so many legends, and he's just a very tough guy to make. I remember that graphic, was it like that visual that they used to show on the screen, where it was like Vitor Belfort, the guy with no known weaknesses in the UFC. The UFC were just glazing him to the next level, but they aren't wrong. He's got powerful striking. He's roided up. He's way stronger than he should be for the for the middleweight division. Scary Brazilian jiu-jitsu, nearly submitted John Jones. You've got to include Vitor Belfort into the mix in the middleweight division, so I'm going to include prime juiced up Vitor. Next fighter, 2015 Chris Weidman. Yeah, Weidman in his prime, I mean, you've got to give him his credit. Knocked out Anderson Silva when Anderson Silva was lapping the middleweight division. First guy to stop the reign of Silva. Very well-rounded as well. Fair enough, he might not, I'm not comparing him to the top middleweights nowadays and saying that he beat the top middleweights, but he was well-rounded in his era, and he's a fantastic wrestler. When he was around, he was one of the best wrestlers in the middleweight division, so I'm going to include Chris Weidman. He's had a decent run in the middleweight division. Fair enough, in these past couple of years, in these past 8 fights, he's kind of fallen off, especially since he got his leg snapped by Uriah Hall. But prime Weidman, I'm going to include him. Next fighter, Khamzat Chimaev. Similar to what I said before about the likes of Pavlovich in the heavyweight division and Yuri in the light heavyweight division. We've never seen anything like Chimaev before. We've just never seen anything like him. The middleweight division has never seen anything like Chimaev. Here, I think he's the scariest grappler in UFC history, even scarier than Khabib. Maybe Khabib was more dominant and was much less beatable than Chimaev, but I think from grappling and how scary he is after his most recent win against Whittaker, I'm including this guy. He's beating guys he shouldn't be beating. He shouldn't be going out there and finishing Whittaker within 2 minutes, breaking his jaw, but he still did it. Unbeaten, never been beat before. Like, imagine prime Chimaev, or current Chimaev, I guess, versus prime Vitor Belfort, like when he was juiced up on roids, or prime Chimaev against prime Anderson Silva. We've never seen anything like Chimaev. I think he's a future champion. I'm including Chimaev in this list. Next fighter, 2016 Michael Bisping. He's the BMF of the middleweight division. Beat Anderson Silva after getting knocked out. That just shows how tough he is. The dude got KO'd by Anderson Silva, but obviously because of his gum shield, Herb Dean didn't stop the fight, and he ends up beating him after that. Was battering juice heads when he was clean. He was fighting in an era where nearly everyone was on juice, and he was winning, and he managed to win a belt doing that as well. So like I said, very tough. Won the belt with one eye, which is one of the most impressive the most impressive accomplishment for him, and just one of the toughest fighters of all time. When it comes to grit and determination, I think Bisping's one of the few fighters that perfectly personify that, so I'm going to include Michael Bisping as well. 2011 Dan Henderson. I know Dan Henderson kind of jumped from weight class to weight class, so it's hard to kind of resign into just one weight class, but prime Henderson, I'm going to include him as well. One of the greatest resumes in UFC history. If you look at Dan Henderson's resume, he's got one of the best in UFC history. So dangerous, one-shot KO power. I mean, that brutal knockout he had over Michael Bisping back in the day. Still to this day, one of the most brutal knockouts in UFC history. And he could probably beat most fighters in his prime. Very dangerous, very skilled. I'm including prime Henderson in the middleweight conversation. And Robert Whittaker. Fair enough, he has lost his last fight to Chimaev, and he's never really been able to get that belt since he lost it, but he's always been a top 3 middleweight of all time. I think he's top 3, like I just said, greatest middleweights of all time. Phenomenal resume as well in the middleweight division. In his era of the middleweight division, apart from a select few, Adesanya, Chimaev, Dricus, who are, all top middleweights even nowadays, he's been able to beat everyone. Arguably beat Adesanya as well in that second fight for the rematch and should have been a 2-time champion. He's a phenomenal striker with solid takedown defense, and you can never really confidently pick against Robert Whittaker. I picked him to beat Chimaev, and I know a lot of people did. You couldn't really confidently pick him to lose to Adesanya, especially after the second fight with Adesanya. He was a massive favourite going into the fight with Dricus du Plessis. And Bobby Knuckles, I'm including him for the middleweight conversation as well. Like, imagine we actually got to see Knuckles versus Bisping. Obviously, Knuckles would have probably beat the shit out of him, but prime Bisping versus Knuckles, that'd just been an absolute war. 2015 Luke Rockhold. Yeah, the middleweight division's not had a bunch of I guess he hasn't had a bunch of legends in, but I'm going to include Luke Rockhold in this. 2015. In his prime, I know he's kind of had a bit of a dodgy resume and he's kind of memed on nowadays, but you've got to respect, look, Rockhold in his prime. Scary kickboxer that was just sleeping everyone. Solid grappling as well. Underrated grappling, as he showed even before the UFC. One of the most athletic middleweights in UFC history. Tough as nails. Even in his most recent fight in the UFC against Paulo Costa, he showed how tough he was. I'm including prime Rockhold in this list. Finished Michael Bisping, beat Michael Bisping as well, so I'm going to include Luke Rockhold. So this is what my middleweight division would look like. If I had to take different fighters at different times and put them all together in the middleweight division, this is what it would look like. You got some old guys like Dan Henderson, Vito Belfort. You got some more modern guys like Dricus du Plessis and Chimaev. This would be my perfect middleweight division if I had to rebuild this division. Then we've got the welterweight division. First fighter, 2012 GSP, prime GSP, the greatest welterweight of all time by far. One of the all-time GOATs. If you don't like John Jones, I guess you can say he's the greatest of all time in any division. Extremely well-rounded, had amazing grappling and jiu-jitsu coming into the UFC, learned to develop striking, very, very technical. He has lost twice, but he's avenged both of those losses. Obviously lost to Matt Serra and Matt Hughes, ended up getting those wins back by finish as well. And no welterweight from two different eras could beat this guy. He kind of ran two different eras in the welterweight division. Nobody could beat him, was on this massive winning streak. Got so bored, and I know this is kind of leaving the welterweight division, but got so bored, came back 4 years later, beat Bisping for the middleweight belt. Again, that's not affecting his welterweight resume, but he's the greatest welterweight of all time. He beat some absolute killers. You've got to include him. Like, imagine prime GSP versus prime Usman. In other words, 2020 Usman. I think the Usman that fought Masvidal the second time, or the Usman that fought Gilbert Burns in the Apex, that was, I mean, it was one of the most unstoppable middleweights of all time. Well, yeah, welterweights of all time. Even Bisping, what's his name, Dana, keeps for some reason calling Usman the greatest welterweight of all time. And even though I think he's the second greatest and not above GSP, Usman in his prime was different, man. Like, he was different. Like, it was so fun watching Usman, and it felt like nobody could stop this guy. Extremely high-level, relentless grappler that nobody could, even like Covington couldn't really stop, with knockout power, as he showed against Burns and Masvidal. And one thing I liked about Usman was that it evolved in every fight. He started off his title run as kind of like a grappler that held people against a cage, had this bad reputation. Then he kind of started mixing their striking. Then he started putting people to sleep. We were watching this dude evolve every single fight. You could never bet against prime Usman. Looked good even in his losses as well. I mean, he was literally a minute away from beating Leon Edwards in that second fight. Usman in his prime. Imagine him versus GSP. That's a super fight right there. So I'm going to include Usman as well. You can't not. 2004 Matt Hughes. Yeah, third greatest welterweight of all time in my opinion, just behind Kamaru Usman. One of the two men to beat GSP, which itself, I guess, is an accomplishment. And one thing I liked about Matt Hughes, even though I do think most current welterweights beat him, especially like prime Usman, he was so strong. Like, people were saying this welterweight Matt Hughes had the strength of like a 205 or like a heavyweight. This dude was extremely strong for his weight class, stronger than some 205ers, good wrestler, solid wrestler, beat GSP, finished him. So I'm going to include Matt Hughes as well in the conversation. For, you know, building the best middleweight division of all time. Next fighter, not middleweight, welterweight division of all time. Next fighter, Leon Edwards. I'm going to include Leon Edwards in the list. I know he gets clowned on nowadays, especially after his recent fight with Bilal, but I feel like he gets overhated. Very well-rounded. Technical striking, good defensive and offensive grappling, as he showed in the Usman fights. Extremely technical on the feet. Underrated grappler. Knocked out prime Usman. Like I just said, Usman, you know, dominating everybody in the welterweight division. He knocked him out cold, and then to prove that it wasn't just a fluke, goes and beats him in the rematch by decision as well. And he's only lost a handful of times in the UFC. I mean, he lost to Bilal Muhammad, the current welterweight champ. He lost to Usman back in the day. He lost his UFC debut to some no-name. And apart from that, this dude ain't losing. He's had a long resume in the UFC. Big winning streak before he got the belt. Then he beats Usman twice, beats Covington as well. So I'm going to include Leon Edwards. Like, imagine we did get to see Leon in his prime against some of the other welterweights. I feel like even though he's been around the welterweight division for so long, there's so many matchups we haven't seen him involved in. I'm going to include Leon. Next fighter, 2004 BJ Penn. Again, BJ Penn's one of these fighters that kind of hopped weight class, but prime BJ Penn, again, one of the greatest of all time. This dude just battered people. Like, he had the boxing like Pacquiao, wrestling like Khabib, BJJ like the Gracies. It felt like anywhere he wanted to take the fight, he just owned it. Like, if he wanted to strike, he was dominating people on the feet. If he wanted to take it to the mat, he looked like a D1 wrestler with a jiu-jitsu like the Gracies. He looked like he just aced every single where just basically everywhere he took the fight. Genuinely a monster. Anywhere the fight went, I put when, but anywhere the fight went, he was a monster. Could be anyone on any given day. And like I said, prime BJ Penn, this might be a bit of a hot take, but prime BJ Penn in his absolute prime, he could batter some of today's welterweights. You're saying prime BJ Penn, and I guess Masvidal isn't today's welterweight, but you're saying prime BJ Penn wouldn't do well against Masvidal or Covington or some of the other top welterweights of nowadays. I think he batters a lot of these guys. In his prime, he was different. Like, he was undersized as well for the welterweight division. He was naturally like he was a small guy. He was naturally like a 155er, basically the size of Topuria. But yeah, I'm going to include prime BJ Penn. You can't not. Robbie Lawler as well, the OG BMF 2014 prime Robbie Lawler. Just such an animal, tough as nails. That fight with Rory McDonald, one of the greatest fights in UFC history. He was just fearless. This dude didn't fear anyone. He just wanted to inflict damage and did a good job doing so. I mean, he's one of the most relentless, most damaging, he'll eat one to land two type of fighters in the UFC. Always brought the fight. Definitely needed in a stacked roster. If we're going to build a stacked roster, you can't not have Robbie Lawler. He was one of the funnest fighters of all time. Nowadays, in the lightweight division, we might have the likes of Chandler and, Justin Gaethje. But back then, back 2014, we had Robbie Lawler. He was like the BMF guy, the guy that was always showing up in fun fights. And one of the most exciting welterweights to ever exist. I'm including Robbie Lawler. 2017, Tyron Woodley. Another fight that kind of gets clowned on, but I think Woodley in his prime, you've got to include him. Such a high-level wrestler. Everyone says he only had an overhand. Yeah, but that overhand would have still slept people. He lands the overhand on most fighters. They're all going night-night. So I'm including Woodley. In his prime, I would favour him against some of today's top welterweights. Prime Woodley was scary, man. I mean, it was like basically like I described a couple of the other fighters. This relentless grappler with dangerous power on the feet. Very explosive. The way that he just completely shut down Darren Till as well. Didn't even get a single significant strike inflicted in that fight. And I think he is truly underrated in the welterweight division. I know he's gone in this big downfall and he got slept by Jake Paul and then he got leaked, but in his prime, Tyron Woodley, I'm including him in the welterweight convo for, the best roster. And then Shavkat Rakhmonov, a more modern fighter again, hasn't even touched gold yet, but I've just got to include him because we've never seen anyone like him. Unbeaten, finished everyone he's faced. That alone is where most of his hype is coming from, and rightfully so. It's insane. One of the most intriguing fighters on today's roster. This guy's been getting hyped for a while, and again, I want to see how he does against Bilal. I would love to see how he does against Leon or JDM. I need to see him against one of the elite welterweights of today. He's basically just got crafty striking, very crafty striking, but most importantly, scary Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Probably the best submission artist right now in the welterweight division. And I just love to see him against some of the legends in their prime. Like, imagine a GSP versus a Shavkat, or a prime Robbie Lawler versus Shavkat Rakhmonov. I'm really intrigued. I feel like there's a lot of questions that haven't been answered when it comes to Shavkat, so I'm going to include him as well. Just literally finished, I'm not even just saying this, but he has finished every single fighter that he's gone against. And 2011 Nick Diaz. I ain't forgetting about Nick Diaz. He was robbed in his prime. Suspended all just for a bit of weed, and then you've got these guys on steroids that are, barely getting any punishment for it. So he was a beast during his prime, even though he got robbed of it. Was so fun to watch, made every single fight fun. He would spice up every single fight, and he had the ability to hang in there with everyone. That fight with Anderson Silva as well when he came back. Basically just had amazing boxing, amazing stamina, amazing output, amazing chin, and even better Brazilian jiu-jitsu. We had the full package back in the day. Again, I'm not saying he competes with nowadays welterweights, but like, imagine like a prime 2019 Masvidal versus a prime Nick Diaz. That's like a dream fight you could make in the UFC. So I'm going to include Nick Diaz. And 2013 Johnny Hendricks, he arguably beat GSP. Fair enough, he was, full to the rim of steroids, but he arguably beat GSP. That's definitely GSP's most controversial win. Tough guy to beat on the steroids, very tough to beat. Just came and brought the fight every single time. Very powerful, can shoot anybody's lights out. So I'm going to include Johnny Hendricks in his prime in this list as well. But that would be my welterweight division if I had to rebuild it and make the current roster. You've got the likes of Prime Usman, you've got the likes of Prime GSP, you've got some killers in there like Shavkat, like Robbie Lawler, like Nick Diaz, you've got the Leon Edwards, you've got you've just got everyone. You've got multiple different eras. That would be my welterweight division. Then for the lightweight division, first fighter, Islam Makhachev. I mean, I think he's the greatest lightweight of all time. I think he's surpassed Khabib or what he's done in these past couple of years, and for that reason, that alone should make him on this list. He's the best fighter in the modern era. Not just the best lightweight, but to be the best fighter in the UFC in 2024, in the modern era of the UFC, is a massive accomplishment. Pound for pound number one, out-wrestles everyone, has submission ability, knockout ability. This dude has no known weaknesses. Like I was saying before about that Vitor Belfort visual, there is no known weaknesses for Islam Makhachev. There is no way you can point at Islam Makhachev and say, yeah, this guy loses. He's got the submission ability, he's got the wrestling, he's got the knockout ability, he's got everything going for him. He's probably the best lightweight we've ever seen from a skills perspective and the most accomplished. I'm going Islam Makhachev, no question questions asked. 2020 Khabib and Magomedov. Now, obviously, Khabib and Makhachev would never fight, but imagine theoretically we were to see a fight between prime Khabib back when he retired in 2020 against current Makhachev. I think he's the most dominant wrestler in UFC history. Everyone knew what he was going to do, and nobody could stop it. He was unstoppable. He was unbeaten. 29-0, perfect record. Second greatest, arguably the greatest lightweight of all time, above Makhachev, you can give or take. But yeah, I think he's the best wrestler. There are some people that say you could put any lightweight in the history of the UFC against Khabib, and they wouldn't be able to beat him, and it's hard to argue with that, maybe apart from Makhachev. So I'm going to include Khabib, no questions asked, one of the greatest of all time. Next fighter, 2016 Conor McGregor. Now, obviously, we've seen McGregor and Khabib, that was back in 2018, but 2016 McGregor, when he just came up to the lightweight division, that performance he had against Eddie Alvarez, one of the best performances we've ever seen. Prime McGregor. There was just something different about Conor McGregor in his prime. Like, he looked unstoppable. He was so accurate and precise with every shot. It's almost as if he was like an AI or some sort of computer-programmed fighter that was programmed to beat every single individual guy that he went against. Calculated, beat everyone. Prime McGregor in the lightweight division, taking away all the antics that he had outside the octagon and all the hype that he brought. If we're talking just from a skills perspective, imagine we saw Prime McGregor against some of today's lightweights. Like, imagine Prime McGregor versus current Gaethje, or Prime McGregor versus current Chandler. It would be some of the best fights you could see. Definitely ends in a finish. Next fighter, 2019 Tony Ferguson. Even talking about Tony Ferguson is kind of depressing, but oh my, this lightweight division is so stacked. Like, imagine Prime Ferguson. We never got to see the fight with Khabib. Prime Ferguson and Prime McGregor. I completely forgot I had Ferguson on this list, and now that I've seen Ferguson, it just makes me want to see these fights even more. Prime Ferguson, he just found a way to beat everyone, man. Like, he shouldn't have been beating the guys that he was beating, and he just found a way to pull off the win every single time. So weird and crafty, but it worked. You look at Tony Ferguson training, you'd probably think he's some random cracker who doesn't deserve to be in the UFC, and he was interim champion at the time on this 12-fight winning streak. Was able to cut everyone and make it a dogfight. People say Khabib was never cut in the UFC. Let me just tell you, if he fought Prime Ferguson, I don't know if he keeps that record of not getting cut in the UFC. This dude's slashing people with his elbows, managed to make every single fight a dogfight, and he's one of the best fighters at the time to not hold the belt. Because that fight with Khabib kept getting postponed, never really got to hold the belt, but I think he is one of the best fighters in UFC history to never hold a belt. Prime Ferguson, one of the most interesting and one of the most dominant, you've got to admit, lightweights in UFC history. Next fighter, 2008 BJ Penn. I said the other time that BJ Penn used to kind of hop from weight class to weight class, and he did well in the lightweight division as well. Just good everywhere. Could finish the fight no matter where the fight went. Fought the best in the division and would beat them or have close fights. And he just butchered people. I already kind of talked about him in the welterweight division, but Prime BJ Penn, tough that you can bet anyone against him. Justin Gaethje, one of the more modern fighters, because he is the most exciting fighter of all time. It's hard to think of a fighter in MMA history who is more entertaining than Justin Gaethje. People say he's your favourite fighter's favourite fighter. I think that's the perfect way to describe Gaethje. Kill or be killed, always putting on bangers every single time. There's never a boring Justin Gaethje fight. He's a modern day gladiator. He's, again, like I said with Yuri, a fighter that you'd be expecting to see on Prime. And the one thing that I love about Justin Gaethje is he's so dangerous. Hits like a truck. Very dangerous. But he's also so vulnerable. He seems to be not chinny, but he seems to just leave himself open to getting caught a lot. He's been dropped a shit ton of times. Very vulnerable. Very dangerous. He's one of the most entertaining of all time. I'm also going to include 2010 Frankie Edgar. Edgar in his prime. Size of a bantamweight, but still beat the best lightweights of all time. Again, I think he's top 5 greatest lightweights of all time. Super skilled from every area of martial arts. Very high level wrestler. Made everyone fight his fight. This dude fought so many different styles, and no matter who he fought, he was making everyone fight his fight. Doesn't matter who he goes against, he would make them fight his fight. I'd love to see Prime Prime Frankie Edgar against some of today's lightweights as well. I'm including Frankie Edgar. Next fighter, 2021 Charles Oliveira. Now, I say 2021, not that he's not good nowadays, but I feel like this was the peak of his career. Most submissions in UFC history. That alone, you've got to include him. An insane record to have the most submissions in UFC history with a shit ton of submissions on his title run. He was running the lightweight division in his prime. Like, before he fought Makhachev, he was just running this division, was on a massive winning streak, had wins over the likes of Tony Ferguson, Michael Chandler, Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje. He ran the division. He found a way to beat the best lightweights in the world. Doesn't matter if he gets dropped or wobbled or loses a round. He's coming back and finishing you in the next fight, just like he did against Chandler. And you can never count him out. You can never count out Charles Oliveira in the fight. Again, like I've said about Justin Gaethje, one of the most entertaining fighters of all time. So I'm going to include Charles Oliveira on this list for one of the most, just to include him in the best roster for the lightweight division. Dustin Poirier, again, similar to the Gaethje and Oliveira's, a fighter that He's timeless as Dustin Poirier. It doesn't matter if you were watching this guy back in the day or you watching him nowadays. He's timeless. He's the greatest lightweight in the world to never win a belt. Actually, I would go as far to say that Dustin Poirier, he is not only a top 30 greatest of all time, but I think he is the greatest fighter in UFC history to never hold undisputed gold. He either messes people up or loses to the best in the world, but still puts on a fight. Again, it doesn't matter who he's fighting, whether it be Khabib or Oliveira or Islam Makhachev. He'll mess people up. He'll make it a dogfight like he did with Makhachev. And if it's not that, he's putting people to sleep. He's finishing Chandler. He's finishing Gaethje. He's finishing Benoit Saint-Denis. Doesn't matter who he fights. He's going to make him fight. He's going to make him pay. He's going to make it a messy fight, or he's going to win. And he's always in a fun fight. Again, like I said about a couple other guys in this list, he's never in a boring fight. I'm including Dustin Poirier. 2012 Benson Henderson, one of the most technical fighters and strategic fighters we've ever seen. Always found a way to win. It's almost as if, like I said before, about guys calculating their fights. This was prime beater like Benson Henderson. He had a really unique style. He could beat some of today's lightweights with his wrestling and pressure. Really good wrestler, really good pressure, and he was ahead of his time as well, in my opinion, was Benson Henderson. Like I said before about Anderson Silva being ahead of his time in the middleweight division, I think Benson Henderson was ahead of his time as well. Super well-rounded, great wrestling, kind of overwhelming pressure that he brought to a lot of fighters. I'm including Prime Henderson in this list, and this would be my lightweight division. Even just looking at all these guys stood next to each other, I mean, you've got Ferguson, you've got Khabib, you've got Makhachev, BJ Penn, Frankie Edgar. I mean, all of these guys. You've got some of the lightweight goats. You've got some of the best, most entertaining lightweights of all time. This would be my lightweight division if I had to rebuild it. And then for the featherweight division, Ilia Topuria. I mean, he's already, in my opinion, made the top 30 GOAT list from what he's done in his back-to-back wins in the UFC. He just truly looks unstoppable right now. A modern guy as well, modern featherweight, and he truly looks unstoppable. Super well-rounded, scary boxer with amazing grappling. He's got submission ability. He's got boxing. Again, like I said with Makhachev, there's no way you can look at when it comes to Topuria and say that he gets beat in this certain area. He could be any featherweight in history of the sport on any given day because of how dangerous he is. One of the most exciting fighters in the world to knock out Alexander Volkanovski and then knock out Max Holloway for the first time back-to-back. The best back-to-back wins in UFC history. Pound for pound top 3 right now. Fighter of the year 2024, or I guess it's between him and Porton, but I'm including Topuria. Definitely got to include him if you're making a resume of just pure featherweights. Next fighter, 2014 Jose Aldo. Greatest featherweight of all time. Fighterweight, it says. But I'd say he's the greatest featherweight of all time is Jose Aldo. Again, you can kind of go back and forth between him and Volk, but the run that this dude went on was insane. He ran the featherweight division for years. Previous to that knockout loss to Conor McGregor, this dude just completely ran the featherweight division. He was so far ahead of everyone in terms of skill. He'd beat the crap out of everyone. And in his prime, you could match him up against every single heavyweight of all time. Featherweight of all time. I don't care if you put in Prime Volk versus Prime Aldo. Prime Aldo's got a chance. Prime Aldo versus current Topuria. I mean, that's a dream fight, but Prime Aldo has a chance. Prime Aldo versus Prime Holloway. He could beat anyone. He's so skilled. One of the most unique strikers we've ever seen. Some of the best leg kicks in UFC history, and went on a generational one. I'm including the best featherweight of all time, in my opinion, Jose Aldo. Next fighter, 2022 Volkanovski, before it all went downhill in late 2023. I mean, I guess his prime was probably the Makhachev fight in like 155 and then the Yair Rodriguez fight. He kind of only went downhill late 2023, but because he was unbeaten this year, Volkanovski at 2022, second greatest, arguably the greatest featherweight of all time. He was literally so much better than every featherweight in the modern era as well. I emphasize the modern era because these are where the best heavyweights are. Featherweights are, and he was just so much better than everyone. I mean, think of how good Max Holloway is, and the fact that he battered him that third time, beat Brian Ortega, beat Yair Rodriguez, beat all these guys that are up and coming. Korean Zombie, he's not an up and comer, he's more of a legend, but he just completely ran the featherweight division, and he beat Aldo as well. Only has one featherweight loss in his entire career to one of the most skilled of all time in Ilia Topuria, which is impressive. And in his prime, he looked unbeatable. In my opinion, top 2 greatest featherweights of all time. You've got to include Prime Volk. Next fighter, 2023 Max Holloway. Yeah, one of the best boxers in UFC history. I mean, there's been a few fighters that you can say has better boxing than him, maybe some of his rivals in Volk and Topuria, but just his hands were so slick. And he's fought every single top heavyweight featherweight to ever exist. He's fought Topuria. He's fought Volk 3 times. He's fought Conor McGregor. He's fought Jose Aldo twice. He's fought nearly every single top featherweight. And not even that, he's fought all the contenders as well. You look nowadays, he's facing the likes of Arnold Allen, Korean Zombie, Brian Ortega, Yair. Like, he's fought everyone in the featherweight division. Think of like any top heavyweight featherweight of all time that he hasn't fought. He's had competitive fights, if not beat some of the greatest featherweights as well. He had a competitive fight with Volk the second time around, which a lot of people say he won. He finished Jose Aldo twice. So you've got to include Max Holloway, one of the most skilled strikers in UFC history, top 15 greatest of all time. I'm including Max Holloway. You can't not. Again, one of the fighters that perfectly represents the featherweight division. 2012 Korean Zombie. Korean Zombie's an absolute beast. He was robbed of his prime. Obviously, this was more of an outside political issue that got him robbed of his prime, but we also got robbed of Korean Zombie's prime, and he just lived up to his name. He was a kill or be killed brawler. He brought the fight to everyone. Even in his last fight against Max Holloway, he went out swinging, lived up to his name, kill or be killed, just an absolute warrior, and was so dangerous as well. Very, very powerful. I'm including prime Korean Zombie. It would have been really good to see how Volkanovski would have matched up in his prime against another prime Korean Zombie, or prime Korean Zombie against, you know, some of the other featherweights in their prime. Very dangerous, came to brawl. 2018 Brian Ortega. Yeah, I'm including Brian Ortega as well. Back in 2018, he was so tough, and I guess he still is so tough. He's fought the best at the time, and he was always in the fight. Like, even in his most recent fight against Diego Lopez, he was able to survive the 3 rounds after getting dropped in the first. He was so tough in those fights with Volkanovski and Holloway as well. He just always finds a way in every fight. Some of the highest level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu we've ever seen in featherweight history. Someone goes far to say he's got the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with how good his submission is. That guillotine he did against Volkanovski. Never in a boring fight as well as Brian Ortega. Even though he's not one of these absolute monsters on the feet like a Gaethje or one of these other fighters that you'd expect to be entertaining, he's still never in a boring fight. And he would just make everyone put their own to beat him. He's so hard to beat, he's Brian Ortega. Not from a skills perspective, but from the fact that the dude just doesn't go out. So, because he's so fun to watch and he's fought the who's who in the featherweight division, I'm including Brian Ortega. 2016 Conor McGregor. Maybe not 2016 Conor McGregor, maybe like 2015, but the McGregor that knocked out Jose Aldo, yeah, I mean, he was arguably the most unbeatable featherweight of all time, undefeated in the featherweight division. I know a lot of people always bring up Conor McGregor when there's a featherweight champion. Some dream fights I've seen is Prime Volk versus Prime McGregor at featherweight, even current Topuria versus Prime McGregor. One of the best strikers. Some say he'd beat today's top featherweights, as I just said, and he was him, man. He was just starching every featherweight that he went against. To look at the run that Jose Aldo went on and to knock him out in 13 seconds is insane. So I'm going to include Conor McGregor on my list. I mean, you can't not. I mean, he's one of the few featherweight champions. 2014 Uriah Faber. He was the #1 featherweight in the world and in WEC at one time. Like, there was a time when he was the best featherweight in the world in WEC, which was basically the UFC for the smaller weight classes. Super underrated in my opinion, gets looked upon when it comes to his career. One of the best featherweights of all time to never win a belt. I mean, he was a champion in WEC, which in my opinion basically translates to a belt in the UFC because it was the same thing basically, just a different company. And I think he could beat some of today's featherweights in his prime. I'm not saying he'd be a top fighter and he'd beat the likes of Topuria or Holloway, but you look at the top 15 right now of the featherweight division or the bantamweight division, because he did go back to back. I think he beat some of today's as well. So I'm going to include Uriah Faber as well in the featherweight division. It would have been really good to see him on the roster. Diego Lopez, all guns blazing. The guy just comes to brawl. Again, one of these fighters that are never in a boring fight. Every single one of his fights in the UFC so far has lived up to it. All guns blazing, comes to brawl. One of the most dangerous, entertaining featherweights of the modern era. Yeah, I mean, he's just never in a boring fight. He brings the fight to everyone, like he did with Dan Ige, like he did with Sadiq Youssef, like he did with Pat Sabatini, like he did recently with Brian Ortega. The guy just brings the fight every single time, and he's so dangerous as well. Hits like a truck, but has scary jiu-jitsu. And I think he would make a fun competitive fight out of any featherweight ever. To think of how stacked the featherweight division would have been, I think Diego Lopez could make a competitive and a fun fight out of anyone you put him against. And he could be the one to beat Ilia Topuria. I mean, he is, in my opinion, the top contender right now of the featherweight division. And he hasn't fought Topuria yet, so he could be the guy to beat him, in my opinion. 2013 Chad Mendes. He brought the fight to Prime McGregor. Like I just said, Prime McGregor was stopping everyone in the featherweight division. This dude brought the fight to Prime McGregor. Like, he was making Prime McGregor work to get that win. He was roughing him up. He was an amazing wrestler. Mixed up his boxing so well too. Ahead of his time with his grappling. Mixed up his boxing with it. And he was just so tough to beat in his prime. Like I said, it took McGregor a couple of rounds to get him out of there as well. Very tough was Chad Mendes. So this is what the featherweight division is looking like. I mean, you've got all 5 featherweight champs of all time on that list as well. You've got a couple of the modern fighters like Diego Lopez and Brian Ortega that I think are just some of the toughest and funnest to see. You've got some of the older guys as well, like Prime Korean Zombie, Uriah Faber, and Chad Mendes. I think this is the perfect featherweight roster if we were to rebuild the featherweight division. So that would be my UFC featherweight division. Bantamweight division, again, a stacked division. Merab. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be disagreeing with Merab because he's viewed as the most boring champion in the UFC, but he's the best of the modern era. That, in my opinion, you've got to include him. You can't just single out Merab because he's boring. I mean, he is the best fighter of today's era, and he's got a great resume as well. He's beat some of the best bantamweights already. He beat Aldo, he beat Sean O'Malley, he beat Henry Cejudo, he dominated Petr Yan. Fair enough, only one of them was for the belt, but if you take away the belt, he's already beaten some great names. 25 minutes of high-paced wrestling. We talk about some of the old good wrestlers in the bantamweight division like Dominic Cruz. They didn't have the same pace as Merab. They used to gas out after a couple of rounds. You've got Merab who's got 25 minutes of the same high-paced wrestling. One of the best bantamweight wrestlers we've ever seen in UFC history. And even though from an entertainment standpoint he's not going to be there, don't worry, I've got you covered. I'm going to include Merab. Next fighter. 2016 Dominic Cruz, the greatest bantamweight of all time. I think defensively he was the best bantamweight of all time. He had this really weird style and weird footwork that just seemed to work, and I think he could beat most of today's bantamweights in his prime. You're telling me prime Dominic Cruz doesn't absolutely starch Marlon Vera that he fought before? Like prime Dominic Cruz versus O'Malley, prime Dominic Cruz even against the likes of Merab and Yan. I think he could beat a lot of today's bantamweights. He was untouchable, very hard to hit, and he could catch you at any given angle. Perfectly set up his shot, so I'm going to include Dominic Cruz as well in his prime. 2017 TJ Dillashaw, roided up and dangerous. I don't care if he was on roids. It made for a fun showing. He beat prime Garbrandt as well twice. Think of how good Garbrandt was in his prime when he just styled on Dominic Cruz, and he beat this guy by finish twice. Second greatest bantamweight of all time in my opinion, despite taking PEDs. And imagine like a dream, prime TJ Dillashaw versus today's bantamweights. Just prime, even just thinking about it, man. Prime TJ Dillashaw versus prime Petr Yan, or prime TJ Dillashaw versus current Sean O'Malley. These are some dream fights. He was just so good with TJ Dillashaw. So dangerous because of the roids, but still dangerous. So I'm going to include prime Dillashaw. The Cruz fight, Cody Garbrandt. Now, I'm not going to single him to a current year, but the Cody Garbrandt that fought in that fight with Dominic Cruz could actually be the best bantamweight ever. This Garbrandt arguably beats any bantamweight to ever exist. He was on smoke for 25 minutes. This was him moment. He was out of the Matrix in this fight. He made prime Dominic Cruz, the greatest bantamweight of all time, look silly. He absolutely schooled him for 25 minutes straight. And I think he's got the fastest hands in bantamweight history. We've got some pretty fast punchers nowadays. I mean, Petr Yan and Sean O'Malley are some to mention, but I don't know if I can say they're quicker than Cody Garbrandt. So the Cody Garbrandt, specifically the one that fought Dominic Cruz, I would bring him in today's roster. Sean O'Malley, again, a fighter that you can't not include. He's just a sniper of a striker with one-hit KO power and ability. Yeah, I mean, we saw it when he knocked out Aljamain Sterling. We saw the absolute wall that he put on Petr Yan. Great takedown defense. I know we just got dominated by Merab, but he still showed decent takedown defense. And again, Merab's the best wrestler in bantamweight history. He showed good takedown defense in that first round against Sterling. He showed it against Petr Yan, so his takedown defense is pretty solid. And he's one of the best, most entertaining bantamweights of today. He's a #1 bantamweight in the world, former defending champion, and he's always in a fun fight as well. Super dangerous as well is Sean O'Malley. Good I don't think he's a good personality. I think his personality is kind of overrated, but he is a star. Like I said before, like imagine prime O'Malley versus prime Cruz, or prime O'Malley versus Garbrandt. Those are some things you want to see, so I'm going to include Sean O'Malley. 2020 Henry Cejudo, the one that moved up to the bantamweight division and took the belt. This dude retired too early. Retired in his prime. He looked phenomenal in the bantamweight division. He was a relentless grappler who developed striking ability late on in his bantamweight career, which seemed to work for him. And he looked amazing at the jump to his bantamweight division in his prime. Why did he have to wait a couple of years until he left his prime to come back and beat Sterling and fight Merab? Because I'm telling you, if in his prime, he would have probably worked those guys. You do prime Cejudo versus Sterling now, he absolutely batters. I know Sterling's in a different division, but he absolutely mauls Sterling. So I'm going to say Henry Cejudo back when he moved up to the 2020, back in 2020 when he moved up to the bantamweight division is someone I'd include. Next fighter, 2013 Renan Barão. Yeah, Renan Barão is a completely overlooked, an absolute boxer. Don't know what that's supposed to mean or why I've tapped it, but he was a really good boxer. He was dangerous during his prime, very dangerous. KO ability, knocked out so many different times, and he was one of the most elite bantamweights of all time during his prime. He would just stay in the bantamweight division at the top level for the longest time, and he was absolutely elite. One of the most overlooked bantamweights in UFC history. No one really mentions it, but he was very, very dangerous. Next fighter, Petr Yan. One of today's top bantamweights. I'm including Petr Yan. This dude's different, man. He's beat so many legends. I remember when they tried to get Uriah Faber, he came back, got a win over Ricky Simón, and for some reason they put him in there with Petr Yan, they ended up getting slept. He's beaten so many legends as Petr Yan. He's kind of like a legend killer. So dangerous on the feet. One of the best boxers in bantamweight history. Very technical, very powerful, and even his grappling's underrated as well. Petr Yan, former champion. I'm including him in the bantamweight conversation. 2022 Aljamain Sterling. Similar point to Merab. Fair enough, it might not be the best from an entertainment standpoint, but he is a former champion, and he's beaten some of the guys on this list. He's beaten Cejudo out of his prime, fair enough. He's beaten Dillashaw out of his prime, I know. He's beaten those guys. He's beaten PTN. So you've got to give him the credit. Elite grappler. The Human Backpack, arguably the second greatest bantamweight of all time. The most elite bantamweight in his era. He ran the bantamweight division for a couple of years. Fair enough, it was a bit fraudulent how he won the belt, but he still had it. KO'd by O'Malley, but he wins a few. Listen, I know this is a bit of a dumb conversation, but if he was to fight O'Malley 10 times, it ain't like he got dominated like Very did. He would win at least some of those fights. Like, I know he got knocked out, but in a situation where he gets a hold of O'Malley's legs, he takes him down and he takes the backpack, maybe even gets a submission because he's a better finisher than Marabi. So 2022 Aljamain Sterling, when he was a champion, I'm going to include him as well. Corey Sandhagen, one of the most well-rounded technical bantamweights of the modern era. Sandhagen's going to be one of those fighters where we miss him when he's gone. We're going to look back at Sandhagen and be like, I remember when Sandhagen was around in his prime and he was just schooling everyone. I'll put him up competitive fights, and this brings me up to my other point, which is he only loses to the elite fighters, and even then he makes it competitive. He lost to PTN but made it a competitive fight. He lost to Umar Nurmagomedov, made it a competitive fight. You know, apart from that, he's just going out there and beating people. He's had some of the best knockouts, one of the best bantamweights in UFC history, in my opinion, to never touch gold. He's always been a top bantamweight, always been top 3, always been one of the best. The way that he schooled Marlon Vera a couple of years ago, the way that he beat Rob Font, the way that he put up a competitive fight against Umar Nurmagomedov, I'd love to see him versus the likes of like Cody Garbrandt, or him, if we're talking more modern, against Sean O'Malley. So I'm going to include Corey Sandhagen, and this would be the best bantamweight division. You've got some of the greatest bantamweights of all time, some of the best of today's era, some of the slickest strikers, the best grapplers, perfect mix of MMA. I think this would be the elite bantamweight division if all these guys were fighting at the same time. And then finally for the flyweight division, 2016 Demetrius Johnson, the guy who the UFC tried to erase, but the guy who will never be, I don't want to sound corny, I'm not going to say it. Anyway, greatest flyweight of all time is Demetrius Johnson. He is the greatest flyweight of all time, arguably the GOAT in general. He's arguably the greatest of all time, regardless of division, which just says everything about him. Pound for pound, in my opinion, the greatest fight in MMA history. Now, if we're talking like a pound for pound list of all times, the most skilled, the best fighter in their prime of all time, I think Demetrius Johnson goes number 1. He was a 10 out of 10 fighter everywhere. No flyweight on the world beats him in his prime. I don't care about today. I don't care about back then. No flyweight in the world even beats him. And you know what? I'm going to go as far to say, even now, after being on the couch for ages, he could come back today out of his prime, and I actually wouldn't mind his odds against Pantoja, who is the defending bantamweight flyweight champion. So Demetrius Johnson, anything to do with flyweight, it has to have his name all over it. He is the king of the flyweight division of all time. Alejandro Pantoja, this dude's beat like 6 current ranked flyweights. To not include Pantoja would be delusional. He's beaten 6 current flyweights. He's the best flyweight of the modern era. I'm not saying he's the best of all time. Obviously, what DJ did was incredible. But if we're talking the modern era, Pantoja's the best. Like I said, beat 6 current ranked fighters. And I think he's actually fun to watch on top of that. He makes every fight a dogfight. He made the fight with Steve Erceg a dogfight. He had a fight of the year contender against Brandon Moreno. Made it a dogfight with Roy Val. And apart from that, he was just finishing people. So I think Pantoja's fun as well. Top 3 greatest bantamweight flyweights of all time. 2018 Henry Cejudo. Yeah, 125 Cejudo was great as well. He was able to beat Demetrius Johnson. Maybe it was a little bit past his prime for DJ, and it was a close fight, but he was still able to beat Demetrius Johnson, which just shows how high level he was. And he's one of the best wrestlers in flyweight history. Imagine prime Cejudo at the 125 against current Pantoja, or even the likes of Moreno. Some dream fights there for Cejudo, so I'm including him in the roster as well. Brandon Moreno, I'm going to include him too. Yeah, Brandon Moreno has close competitive fights with nearly every single top flyweight today. Like, he recently had a battering that he put up against Amir Albazi. He had a very close fight with Roy Val. He had a very close fight with Pantoja. He's a former champion, never in a boring fight. It's either him going life and death with someone, or it's him butchering someone. He's an elite boxer with solid ground game. Submitting Davis Figueiredo was super impressive, and apart from that, he's probably the best boxer right now at flyweight, and he's got a really good resume for the modern flyweights. He's beaten a shit ton of ranked fighters. He's a former champion, beat Figure when he was at Bantamweight flyweight multiple times. So I'm going to include Brandon Moreno on this list as well. 2020 Davison Figueiredo, second greatest flyweight of all time in my opinion. He is quite far off Demetrius Johnson still, but he is in my opinion the second greatest of all time. He beat Pantoja and Moreno. Those two guys are the best of the modern era and have been for the past couple of years, and he beat both of those guys. I know he also lost to Moreno a few times, but he has wins over them. He's got elite Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, really high level grappling, powerful hands, and it's a shame we never got to see him versus Demetrius Johnson. A dream fight for me would be Prime Davison Figueiredo versus Prime Demetrius Johnson. That would be one of the highest level, if not the highest level fight we would ever see in the flyweight division, so I'm going to include Figueiredo. 2016 Joseph Benavidez. Now, obviously, he ended up fighting Figueiredo later on in his career, ended up getting absolutely slaughtered. But 2016 Joseph Benavidez, he's got the third most wins. I think he's tied third most wins in flyweight history. He stayed at the top of the flyweight division for the longest time, and he fought nearly every top fighter. He had a really long career. He fought everyone at the top. In his prime, he puts up a scrap with some of today's top flyweights. I'm not going to say he beats today's top flyweights, but in his prime, he puts up a tough fight. I think Joseph Benavidez is one of the most elite and one of the most iconic flyweights of all time. Get Amir Albazi out of there. Get Makayev out of there. Get out Manel Kape, who can't even make weight. Bring in Joseph Benavidez, BMF. Brandon Royval. Yeah, I'm including Royval as well. I think he's the best non-champion of the modern era. Every single one of his fights are fun. I mean, look at what he's been done already. He put up a fairly competitive fight with Pantoja. He beat Brandon Moreno recently. He just shut down the prospect and took the away of Tatsuro Taira. And apart from that, he has some other good ranked wins. He has competitive fights with everyone, even the champ. He's an amazing striker who has high output, great boxing, and solid grappling base, as he showed in his recent fight with Taira. Every one of his fights are fun. Underrated in the UFC. Potential future champion. I'm including Brandon Royval in the list of great flyweights. Next fighter, 2015 John Dodson. He's one of the hardest hitters in flyweight history. He might actually be the hardest hitter in the history of the flyweight division. He's really tough to beat on the feet. He had amazing counters. He'd lure you in and then counter, and most of the time it'd knock people out. And he has a knockout chance against any flyweight in history. I mean, he dropped, I know he was in the Bantamweight division, but he dropped Demetrius Johnson and he dropped Peter Yan. He dropped Demetrius Johnson twice in like 20 seconds. That just shows you how powerful this dude is. And I don't care which flyweight we're talking about. At any given time, apart from DJ, who he lost to twice, he could knock out any flyweight in history. So I'm including John Dodson, and I'm going to include Tatsuro Taira, again, a guy that hasn't even fought for the belt yet, but he's probably the best Brazilian jiu-jitsu artist of the modern era, which I think would mix things up well against guys like Figueiredo and Demetrius Johnson and Pantoja. Really fun to see. Either finishes his fights or he puts up a dogfight, as we just saw against Brandon Royval, and I think he is still a top flyweight in the world despite his fight with Royval. He's young. He's undefeated. Well, was undefeated previous to his fight with Royval, and he put up a close competitive fight in the biggest fight. Yeah, I think he's going to rebuild and become a top flyweight. Rodtang with training. Not UFC fighter, but I'd really love to see Rodtang in the UFC. This dude has Gorton Muay Thai. If he can make 125, he would be the best striker in probably 125's history, and probably beats every single flyweight to ever exist, including Moreno, including Royval, including DJ on the feet. Obviously, we did see him against GD. DJ got choked out, and that's why I wanted to say, if you give this dude grappling training, you send this dude to Dagestan for a couple of years, this dude's unstoppable. He learns a bit of takedown defense. Who he's beating? Rodtang. He's the best. He's a Gorton Muay Thai fighter, one of the best of all time. That would be my flyweight division, in my opinion, if I had to rebuild the flyweight division, and that's obviously the end. That would be my every single UFC weight class. If I had to make the best roster for every UFC weight class, the best top 10, let me know your thoughts on this list. Thank you for watching.